Tom Platz is 70 years old. His legs are the most famous in the history of bodybuilding. His training philosophy reshaped an entire sport, and for 3 decades he said very little about one of the more unusual chapters of his career, the years he spent working inside Vince McMahon's world. That period is what this piece examines. Because what happened wasn't only about bodybuilding. It involved power, spectacle, and a business mogul's attempt to absorb an entire sport into his enterprise. To understand it fully, it helps to start with what Platz accomplished as a competitor, and what was denied him on the competitive stage. The outcome of the 1981 Mr. Olympia left a mark that never entirely faded, and it goes some way toward explaining why, a decade later, McMahon's offer would have carried the weight that it did. At the 1981 Mr. Olympia, Platz walked on stage with a physique that had no real precedent. His lower body development was extraordinary by any standard, and his posing routine drew a sustained response from the crowd. Judges, fans, and journalists in attendance left the venue widely convinced they had seen something significant. The results placed him third. Franco Columbu took the title. The reaction within bodybuilding was immediate and critical. Many felt the judging was indefensible. Some argued that Platz's extreme lower body development had worked against him, that judges penalized him for departing too far from the conventional ideal of a balanced physique. Others pointed to the influence of internal politics. The debate over what determined the outcome that night has persisted in bodybuilding circles ever since. What remains uncontested is that Platz, at what was likely the peak of his competitive condition, did not receive the title. He continued competing. He placed fourth at the 1984 Olympia. He won the 1985 Night of Champions. By any reasonable measure, his resume was exceptional. But the Olympia title, the one result that defined the sport's hierarchy, never came. By the late 1980s, his competitive career was drawing to a close, and he had moved into coaching, speaking, and mentorship. He was becoming a different kind of presence in bodybuilding, a teacher, and a representative of the sport's golden era. It was around that time that someone from the world of professional wrestling arrived with a proposition that was, on its face, difficult to take at face value. By 1990, the World Wrestling Federation had become the dominant entertainment force in American sports. Vince McMahon had taken a regional wrestling promotion and built it into a global phenomenon, turning Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant into cultural icons and producing WrestleMania, one of the most commercially successful annual events in television history. He had taken a sport the mainstream considered a joke, stripped away any pretense of athletic legitimacy, leaned into pure spectacle, and built an empire. That same year, McMahon turned his attention to bodybuilding. Not out of any affection for the sport, and not to serve its athletes. His intention was to do to bodybuilding what he had done to wrestling, amplify it, build personalities around physiques, and sell the package to a mass audience. At the time, professional bodybuilding was firmly controlled by the Weider brothers. Joe and Ben, their IFBB was the governing body. Their Mr. Olympia was the sport's pinnacle. Their magazines, Muscle and Fitness and Flex, were the industry standard. McMahon believed he could displace all of it. He did not announce that intention publicly. His first move was the launch of a bodybuilding magazine called Bodybuilding Lifestyles, a modest enough entry that drew little concern from the Weiders. To them it registered as a minor nuisance, nothing more. McMahon's next move was to bring in Tom Platz as a consultant and talent scout for the magazine. Platz was one of the most respected figures in bodybuilding, well-connected and widely admired within the sport. His involvement gave the venture immediate credibility. What the arrangement also gave McMahon was access to bodybuilding's inner world at a moment when he was quietly building something much larger than a publication. September 15, 1990. The Ari Crown Theater in Chicago, Illinois. The closing ceremonies of the IFBB Mr. Olympia competition were underway. Lee Haney had just won his 7th consecutive Olympia title. The Weider brothers were presiding over the sport's most important annual event. McMahon and Platz were in the building. Listed as magazine sponsors, they had paid $5,000 for a booth, a standard sponsorship arrangement that attracted no particular scrutiny. When the closing ceremonies began, Tom Platz took the stage. The audience knew him well. His association with a new bodybuilding magazine was public knowledge. Nothing about his presence seemed out of place. Standing before 4,600 people at an event run entirely by the IFBB, Platz announced the formation of the World Bodybuilding Federation, a direct competitor to the organization whose event he was attending. He stated that the WBF intended to, in his words, kick the IFBB's ass. The announcement was made at an IFBB event, in front of the Weider brothers without any prior public indication that it was coming. The ambush extended beyond the stage. Models wearing WBF sashes moved through the audience distributing pamphlets, while McMahon's team had been sliding contract offers under the hotel room doors of IFBB competitors. Offers for money most of them had never seen in their careers. The following morning at a press conference, McMahon stated that the WBF would feature bodybuilding the way it was meant to be. Most in the room understood the implication. It was a signal that the WBF would not conduct testing, that competitors could come without scrutiny of what they were putting in their bodies. Ben Weider, IFBB co-founder and one of the most influential figures in international sports at the time, reportedly described the ambush as neither sophisticated nor honorable. Publicly, he said he was not angry. Behind closed doors, the Weiders were furious. Their sport had been infiltrated at its own championship, and their athletes were being recruited with money the IFBB could not match. For Platz, that moment on the stage was the most McMahon thing he would ever witness, and he was standing at the center of it. The WBF was officially announced in January 1991 at a press conference held at New York's Plaza Hotel. McMahon arrived with 13 signed competitors, many of them established IFBB names who had left for the money. The money was substantial. Reports indicated some contracts were valued at close to $400,000 per year. At that time, top earners in the IFBB were making roughly $50,000 annually. McMahon was not simply competing with the Weiders, he was outbidding them by an order of magnitude. Tom Platz took the title of Director of Talent Development, serving as McMahon's chief recruiter and the editorial voice of the WBF's magazine. He had publicly assured the bodybuilding world that the WBF would not follow the model of professional wrestling. Bodybuilding would remain bodybuilding. Athletes would not be recast as characters, would not cut promos or adopt fictional personas. The WBF, he maintained, would be a legitimate sports organization. Better funded and better produced, but a sport nonetheless. That position did not hold. McMahon's vision was built around entertainment, not competition. He required each competitor to develop an alter ego, a marketable character that could appeal to wrestling audiences. One bodybuilder was positioned as an aggressive biker, another as a wealthy, confrontational young man. There was a surfer, there was a competitor dressed as a vampire. These were not athletes preparing for a sporting event. They were personas being developed for a programming slate. The competitors appeared alongside WWF wrestlers in episodes of Family Feud. McMahon's ICO Pro supplement brand was prominently featured across WWF programming. The boundary between bodybuilding competition and wrestling entertainment was eroding in real time. Platz remained at the center of it. He was McMahon's public representative for the project, the man who had strained his relationship with the Weiders and the IFBB to stand on that stage in Chicago. Whatever his private assessment of the direction things were taking, he was already committed. Then McMahon organized what became known as the Great American Squat-Off. Platz was matched against Fred Hatfield, who held the world record in the squat and was known as Dr. Squat. The matchup was framed as a clash of styles, Platz's high-rep, high-volume approach against Hatfield's powerlifting background. It was presented as a genuine rivalry between two of the strongest squatters in the sport. Years later, Hatfield clarified what it actually was. In his own words, he and Platz worked for Vince McMahon, and as a marketing gimmick, they were obliged to go head-to-head. It was a publicity stunt. McMahon had engineered a moment designed to generate coverage and build interest in his organization. The integrity of the competition was secondary to that objective. The first WBF Championship aired as a pay-per-view event on June 15, 1991, from Atlantic City. Critics noted that the show sat somewhere between a bodybuilding competition and a wrestling spectacle. The theatrics McMahon had said would not be present were front and center. Reviews were mixed. Audiences were uncertain about what they were watching. The numbers came in well below what McMahon's team had projected. By mid-1991, the organization was already under strain, and not only at the WBF. The steroid scandal that had been developing around the WWF became public, and every organization carrying Vince McMahon's name came under increased scrutiny. Federal authorities were paying attention. Journalists were investigating. McMahon moved quickly. In March 1992, he announced that the WBF would begin comprehensive drug testing, overseen by physician Mauro Di Pasquale. The WBF's television program began airing segments on the dangers of steroid use. The shift in direction was abrupt. The difficulty was apparent to outside observers. The WBF's appeal had been built largely on what it was willing to permit. The physiques on display were a direct product of what competitors had been using. Now McMahon was requiring them to compete clean, with 3 months of preparation time. The results were damaging. A number of competitors tested positive in the weeks leading up to the second championship, resulting in suspensions and leaving athletes demoralized. Athletes who had signed contracts under an entirely different set of conditions. Lou Ferrigno, who had joined the WBF under a reported contract worth $900,000 per year, and had stated publicly on The Tonight Show that the WBF operated under the strictest testing in professional sports, withdrew from his contract 3 months before the event. Given what was unfolding at the time, the weight of that specific endorsement was difficult to overstate. Lex Luger, another prominent name associated with the WBF, was sidelined by a motorcycle accident. The second WBF Championship aired on June 13, 1992, co-hosted by Platz, McMahon, and Bobby Heenan, with Mean Gene Okerlund serving as MC. Paid viewership came in at roughly 3,000 buys. For context, a moderately successful wrestling pay-per-view at that time might draw several 100,000 buys. 3,000 represented not a setback, but a conclusion. 12 days later, Vince McMahon called Ben and Joe Weider personally to inform them that the WBF was being dissolved. The organization that had declared it would compete directly with the IFBB was gone in under 2 years. The bodybuilders who had left the IFBB restructured their careers and signed WBF contracts were left without an organization. The magazine folded, the supplement line stalled, the television show was cancelled. Tom Platz, who had stood on that stage in Chicago and helped set the whole enterprise in motion, was left with the wreckage of something that had lasted less than 2 years. McMahon approached the bodybuilders the same way he approached his wrestlers, as entertainment properties. Their physiques were assets, their personalities were products. The fact that they had spent years building competitive careers and cultivating identities within a specific sporting culture was largely beside the point. What mattered was whether they could move product, generate press, and fill arenas. When Platz had told the bodybuilding world that the WBF would not become like wrestling, he was expressing a genuine intention, one that was, from the beginning, incompatible with McMahon's actual vision. Fred Hatfield's account is instructive. He stated that McMahon had intended from the start to create a bodybuilding version of entertainment modeled on pro wrestling, and that he hired Platz and Hatfield specifically to execute that plan. That framing is significant. They were brought in to carry out a predetermined vision, not to collaborate on a concept or help shape its direction, but to implement something McMahon had already decided. The preferences of the athletes, the traditions of the sport, and the expectations of the bodybuilding community were not part of the equation. That context helps explain why Platz has said little about this chapter over the years. McMahon paid him more than he had previously earned, gave him a title and a platform, and then used his credibility as leverage against an institution that had defined his career before quietly shutting the operation down when it became a liability. That is not a story most people are in a hurry to tell. It gets processed privately. Life moves forward. The work continues, coaching, seminars, training the next generation, and that particular episode stays closed. At 70, Tom Platz has outlasted the organization that tried to absorb him. He was present at the beginning and watched the ending unfold, as everyone else did, except that he carried 30 years of private context that the public did not have. What he chooses to say, and when he chooses to say it, carries weight not only for the history of bodybuilding or the WBF, but for the broader question of what it means to have been close to power and to have come through it with your reputation intact. That is what gives Platz's long silence its significance, and what makes him speaking now at 70 with nothing left to protect worth paying attention to. This story extends beyond bodybuilding or professional wrestling. It concerns what people build, who they trust to help build it, and what that costs when the person they trusted proves to be something different from what they presented. Platz built his legacy through his own effort, one training session at a time. McMahon built his through other people's silence. The distance between those two approaches and the 30 years between the WBF's collapse and the present may be the most durable lesson this entire episode has to offer.